an overly tight, overly conservative player who isn't willing to value bet on the river. So you need to find those players in the game. You need to take advantage of that and actually catch them bluffing. Of course, you have to see which ones of those players are willing to bluff. There are always going to be certain players at the table who just won't bluff, and you certainly need to pay attention to that. But a player that doesn't value bet is actually the kind of player that it's easier to catch them bluffing, and you need to make sure that you have value betting in your game, or else they're going to be able to do that to you. Well, I want to look now at a hand that I played against Johnny Chan at the final table of the 1987 World Series of Poker. And it's going to illustrate a point that I see a lot, and that is, on Fish Street, a lot of players seem to lose their nerve. They've put their opponents on a variety of hands, and they're running them down with a marginal hand or maybe even a weak hand because they suspect that their opponent's bluffing. And then there's something about the fact that all the cards are out now and your opponent has bet one more time at you that seems to scare a lot of people out of a pot. But basically, you need to learn to recognize what a good card looks like on the river. And then you need to stick to your guns. You have the courage of your convictions. If you had a real reason to think your opponent was bluffing on 4th Street, you probably shouldn't change that opinion unless something drastic happened either with the flop or there's something about how he's bet the pot on the river. You shouldn't be looking for excuses to get out of the pot. So anyway, this was a simple hand, and I was very young at the time. I'd only been playing for maybe three or 4 years. And I certainly got very fortunate to get to that final table. Now I was up against one of the great players ever. But I raised on the button with a pair of pocket threes, and he called in the blind. And the flop came Queen 9-4, and he checked. If I were playing the pot today, I probably would have bet on the flop, and there's a very good chance that this hand would have ended on the flop. But the way I played it there was the final table. There was a lot of pressure. I actually didn't have a huge stack at the time, and Chan just had the entire table dominated. He just had like every chip on the table. So I was a little intimidated, and I checked. So the next card came a deuce, which certainly is a great card for my hand. There's no chance that, I guess unless he had a pair of pocket deuces, that he's now drawn out on me. So if I had the best hand, I almost certainly still have the best hand. And now he made about a pot-sized bet. There was about 30,000 in the pot, and he bet about 30,000. And just everything in my bones told me that he was bluffing, that he was trying to run over me. Obviously, that was quite likely. He had a huge stack, and that's what big stacks do at final tables. So I really, really felt like he was bluffing. But I also felt like there was a decent chance that he would try and bluff again on the river. So I actually took my time. I did have a thought I probably had the best hand, but I wanted to make sure that he knew that I didn't have a strong hand. And you might think that that's strange, but I actually wanted to encourage him to bluff on the river. So I took my time, and I did call. And then the river card came, and it's a pair of fours, and more inexperienced players might not see this as a very good card. But again, this is a great card. Again, unless he had me beat going in, I almost certainly have the best hand. In fact, I do certainly have the best hand if I had the best hand going in. If this 4 helped his hand, he already had me beat. He either had a 4, a queen, or a 9. And obviously, a deuce, I still have the best hand against a deuce. So he bet again. He put me all in for about 70,000 more. And at this point, I didn't hesitate. I recognized that this 4 was a great card for my hand, and I called him very quickly, and he just knocked the table and said that he was bluffing. So, that was definitely the highlight of that final table. We were down to 6th at the time, and I ended up finishing 5th. So there wasn't a whole lot of good that happened to me after that hand. But I still remember that hand to this day, and it's really taught me a very good lesson. And it really doesn't matter who you're against. It's just as hard for Johnny Chan to make a big hand or a pair, and sometimes you just have to stick by your guns, stay with your reads, and not lose your nerve on the river. Okay, we're going to finish our discussion of river play with a hand actually that came up recently in a $10,000 tournament in California. And it will be an example of some of the things that you need to think about when betting on the river, but also how much information is actually available to you during a hold'em hand, and how you can add up all that information and come up with some very correct, but very specifically correct answers to how much should I bet, should I check on the river. You have so much information available to you, you ought to be able to make some very good decisions on the river of a no-limit hold'em hand. And it certainly started out as a rather normal hand. A player in first position at a full table limped in for 2,000. We were playing 1,000, 2,000 blinds. And he limped in for 2,000. And everyone folded around to me. I was in the small blind with 1,000 already committed. And I had a very good limping hand, a nice hand where you just want to see a flop. I had a lot of chips. The guy who limped in had a lot of chips. And so I called 1,000, and the big blind checked. So now there's about 7,000 in the pot, and we all saw a flop. And it was a good flop for my hand, certainly. I flopped top pair. And I should first of all say, I had observed the player who limped in up front limp in quite a bit, and he was limping with a lot of hands. He usually had an ace in his hand when he limped in, but I did see him limp in with ace-king on occasion. He was doing a lot of limping. He also did some bluffing. He didn't look to me to be an extremely experienced player, but he did seem to be playing pretty well, and he had a lot of gamble to him. He had definitely been moving his chips, and he had his chips up to about 40 or 50,000, but I did have him covered at the time. So I certainly wanted to give him a chance to bet at the pot. I also realized there was a chance that he had limped with a very big hand like aces or kings or queens, and so I didn't really want to commit a huge amount of money to this pot right away, and I checked. The big blind checked, and this player now bet 3,000. And, here is a situation where I think a lot of players now would say, well, I have the best hand. I don't want an ace, a king, or a queen to come up. It's time to raise. I probably have the best hand. And certainly that's not a bad play here. But I was pretty comfortable playing beyond the flop with this player. I felt like I would get a lot more information by just calling and sort of waiting to commit a lot of chips. So I called 3,000. And the big blind folded. And so he was out of the hand. We'll put him in the muck over here. Okay, so we'll look at what came up on 4th Street. And again, a very good card for my hand. But as I said before, I really wasn't sure whether or not I had the best hand. I felt that by checking I would get some more information. Either he's going to bet and I'm going to have to make a decision as to whether I'm just beat by ace-jack or an overpair. But really I'm hoping he's going to check here, and that would pretty much indicate to me that I have the best hand. I checked, and he checked. So now I'm fairly certain that I have the best hand. Probably over 90% of the time I have the best hand here. And I'm certainly hoping that an ace, a king, or queen doesn't come up. And I'm probably going to bet if one of those 3 cards don't come up. I mean, I'm going to bet a fair amount, maybe around the pot, and maybe try and get him to call me with a pair of pocket 10s or pocket 8s. So we will look at what the last card came, and it really was a very bad card for my hand. It was a king. And as I had said before, he had limped in with hands like ace-king before. He certainly could have had a hand like king-queen, a gut-shot straight draw with 2 overcards, and he just took advantage of his free card. I really didn't think he had queen-10, as that wouldn't be the kind of hand that I saw him limping in with. So I have a pretty good feel for his hand, but he could certainly have 10s, he could have queens, or he could have some kind of ace. And in fact, I had seen him at one point limp in with a hand like ace-7 suited. So I thought he could have some kind of ace. And here I just started thinking, now you have all this information. I know how he plays. I know the kinds of hands that he could have. And now I'm thinking about, well, what would be the right thing to do here? And certainly, I think a lot of players would check. They would be very worried about the king, and they might be thinking, well, maybe I can let him bluff if I check. I actually thought that checking wasn't right. And the reason I was worried about checking was he was the kind of player who might bluff. And I felt like if I checked to him, he might be very likely to bet somewhere in the neighborhood of $10,000 into this pot that has about 13,000. And the problem is I'm pretty much going to have to call, because I know there's a pretty good chance that my hand is good, and I'm getting over 2 to 1. So if he does have a king-queen or an ace-king in his hand, I'm going to lose about $10,000 to the hand. Yes, if he's